Zahara and the Lost Books of Light. I'm really delighted to be here and kind of take you along on my journey because it was really a 20-year gestation period. And so I put together a little PowerPoint presentation. And I'm going to start right now to kind of take you along with me and sort of provide some basis for discussion, etc. So here we go. So in the weeks after September 11th, 2001, so we are going back more than 20 years, Samyapani and I formed a vocal ensemble that we called Abráce. And our mission was to try in our own small way to counteract the drums of war by creating harmony between cultures through music, kind of a modern convivencia. And little did I know that this musical adventure, we played many concerts throughout the Pacific Northwest, and little did I know that this adventure would also inspire me one day to write a book. So fast forward, many years, and I'm in Seattle at the airport, and my husband brought me a newspaper article in the Seattle Times, and he said, I think this has something to do with the book that you want to write about the convivencia. And sure enough, Doreen Alhadeff had applied for her Spanish citizenship. She was the very first person to do so, to reclaim her citizenship from Spain, which was offering this to people with a Sephardic background who had been expelled from Spain in 1492. So I had coffee with Doreen, and I also met Hazan Isaac Ozase, who's sitting next to her, and took a Ladino class from him to get myself started and meet more people in the Sephardic community here in Seattle, which is considerable. I think there's about 5,000 people. So since the protagonist was going to Spain, I decided, of course, that I needed to go as well and follow in her footsteps. And on my first night in Andalusia, I found this plaque in a small town. Some friends took me up the hill. And it's about two lovers, Muslim and Christians, whose spirits were said to meet whenever water flows down into this fountain that you can see over here. And this, for me, became a metaphor for the many complex relationships that have evolved in Spain throughout the centuries. I became fascinated with the era of the convivencia. Great works of art were produced by Jewish and Muslim artists in collaboration. This is a great example here from the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It's called the Kennicott Bible, and you can see lavishly illuminated Hebrew text that's also illustrated with Islamic motifs. Unfortunately, the convivencia was brief, and in 1498, in the Plaza de Bibarambla, thousands of precious manuscripts, handwritten in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic, were burned by order of the Inquisition. And in the prologue to Zahara, I tried to give a little taste of what some of these books might be, and later on I'll talk about how I researched, what books might have been burned in the square. Thousands of tomes lie strewn about the square, stacked as high as the shelves they once occupied in the libraries of Al-Andalus. The poetry of Muhammad ibn Hani, works of philosophy by Moses Maimonides, and commentaries on Aristotle by Ibn Rushd, scientific treatises by Abu Nasr al-Farabi, Muslim and Jewish holy books, all judged as heretical and in equal peril. The smell of incipient violence taints the air. I asked myself, what if? And, this is, I think, something that really gets writers started, is that what if question when it finally comes to you and you start writing. Because I did research for over a year, and my husband kept saying, when are you going to stop going to the library and start writing? And I think when this what if came to me was when I actually had the confidence to start the book. And so I asked, what if these treasures were rescued from the flames of the Inquisition by two powerful mystics? What if the Sufi sage Ibn al-Arabi and the Jewish rabbi Abraham Abulafia had worked together to find a pair of human hands to save this precious knowledge and transport the books that were saved to a cave in La Alpujarra? And I chose an old salt mine. I did some research and discovered that many libraries put their books in salt mines when they're remodeling because they stay dry and safe. And so I tried to base this piece of alternative history. There's a lot of real history in Zahara, but there's also some fantasy, and this is part of the fantasy. But for me, it became very real. It's kind of interesting when your imagination takes over and you go with it. So there's nothing like a strong female protagonist, and Alienor Crespo, who's based in part on Doreen Alhadeff. She I decided to create someone who was capable of pulling all the pieces of the mystery together and help her new Spanish friends to save the Library of Light, which was formed in 1498. And then in the book, it lasts all the way into the 21st century. And there's a big decision to be made in the book about whether or not to reveal themselves after they've been hiding, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there's quite a bit of suspense in the book. But there's also philosophy and history and some mystical experiences that Alienor has, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. So that's kind of my introduction, and I hope that you can pick up on that wherever you'd like. I'm happy to answer any questions, Zahara, and it's really great to meet both of you and an honor to be here.
Well, it's definitely our honor to have you here, and I really enjoyed the book. Whenever I have it, I have to show that I definitely enjoyed the book. So I want to start off just a little bit about you yourself. In Ronnie's introduction, we talked about that you were born in Cairo, and
no, I was born in the Bronx.
Oh,
so I'm sorry.
No, that was on me. That was on me. I gave it to him. Where did I get
okay.
that? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know, but the person that you described was not me. I'm sorry.
That's so strange.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt. Even though I'm from New York, I didn't want to interrupt.
You should have interrupted. So we're going to have to reintroduce you in a few minutes. Yourself. We confused the two. I
kept thinking that maybe she was coming. There was another Joyce that was coming as a special guest or something. I'm thinking this.
No, that's completely on me, and that was
really sorry about that. Well, we didn't. Okay.
Oh, it's
no,
okay.
No, that's completely. Ronnie followed what I did, and I've done this before, unfortunately. So,
well, you put me in really good company, and I appreciate it.
We did, because she is also an amazing writer herself, and so I do see that you were born in the Bronx. And you moved to Manhattan, and now you do most of your traveling through your writing. So I'm picking up on that. And you have also worked as a screenwriter. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the different styles that you write in, since the thing I gave to Professor Perellis wasn't correct. So can you tell us a little bit about your songwriting and your screenwriting, and how you see yourself in different genres?
Yeah, well, I started out as a poet in New York and writing poetry on the bus. And so it seems a real economy of words that goes into poetry. It has to be, very essential. And so that carried over into writing lyrics for songs. And I went to the High School of Music and Art and as a vocal major, and I did some songwriting there and was really encouraged, and had sort of a career as a singer-songwriter for many years, and moved out to the West Coast. And I started writing short stories a bit later, so it seemed like each genre there were more words involved. And in screenplay writing too, the words are subservient to picture. And so I was really intimidated at the idea of writing a book, because there's a lot more words involved. And but I felt if I could use some of my visual talent and apply it to writing in a novelistic style, that it might work. And so I wrote a couple of mystery novels that are set in New York. The protagonist is named Jo Epstein, and she's a poet and a private investigator. So my brother was a private investigator. I was a poet, and I put the two of us together, and we had these adventures in my first books. So they really, really enjoyed writing them. And then I moved on. I wrote a book that's set in India that I collaborated with an Indian author, Arindam Roy, on, called Rivers Run Back. And then came Zahara, at which I talked about extensively, how it was inspired by music. So it all sort of comes together, and I still perform occasionally. Abráce may get back together again. So it for me, the music has always informed my writing, and also culturally, like the Ladino songs that we sang in the group got me more interested in my own culture. I'm Ashkenazi, but we really appreciate Sephardic music. Actually, I got the music from a cantor at a Ashkenazi synagogue here in Seattle. She gave me all this Sephardic music, and I brought it into Abráce. And so it was sort of natural for me to fall into creating a character based on Doreen. And my neighbor across the street, Ralph Capelouto, his whole family comes from the island of Rhodes. And we talked a lot before I started writing. I'm really lucky that I live where I do.
Right, like you said, there is a very large Sephardi community in Seattle, very much so.
Yeah.
So let's move on a little bit to the book itself. Okay, so as you mentioned, part of the book is about a hidden library, and the books were saved in the salt mines, and then it becomes this huge hidden library. I don't know how else to say it. And it goes back to the ideas of convivencia, especially that there are secret places of worship. So how did that tie into your view of today's struggles and prejudices in parallel to the Inquisition and the kind of the differences in anti-Semitism maybe today and the obvious different anti-Semitism of the Inquisition? Were there, because you have people from today and people from then in your novel.
Yeah, I think in modern times, most of the opposition to the library comes, in this case, from the extreme right in Spain, because they deny the existence of a convivencia. And when I was doing some research looking for an antagonist, because you've got to have a strong antagonist for a novel, I discovered there were quite a few out there who were in great denial and just had still holding, just much like in the United States, holding on to this sense of nationalism and supremacy of one group over another. And so I tackled that a little bit in the story. Some people wanted me to do even more, but I found that it was realistic that the librarians, who are the real heroes of the book, like Alienor is the protagonist, but it's really the librarians who have carried this forward through the centuries and kept these books safe, who are the main heroes of the book. And I relate to what's happening now with the banning and even burning of books in our very own country in the United States and other countries too. This is becoming more and more prevalent, and books are being banned in schools. And it's not just anti-Semitism, it's just anti-intellectualism in general, anti-humanism, just anything that portrays life from another culture, basically. Depends where you are, but it's just this whole tendency towards nationalism and fundamentalism. So it's dealt with in the book, but in the form of a story. You know, there's not a lot of preaching in the book, but I think people can draw their own conclusions about it. And recently I read a book called Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge by Richard Avedon, who is a director at the Bodleian Library. And one thing that he portrays is the bravery of the Bosnian librarians when the books were burned in the National Library of Sarajevo. And it made me cry, actually, those passages. And so it's just a universal problem, and also a universal inspiration that there are people that are brave enough, you know, to try to hold on to history and portray it with some kind of accuracy. It's a huge issue right now with all the disinformation and everything that's going on. And so all this fed into the book, and I think it was in some ways my way of dealing with this new reality that we're living in, that I could write this book instead of feeling really depressed about what was happening. So I think that's another thing that authors sometimes do. You know, we take the things we really care about and we put them into fiction.
Joyce, I want to just add something to what you were saying about kind of the contemporary politics a little bit. It's interesting, as dark as things can seem, sometimes there's surprising countercurrents. I'll just give one from 20th century Spain, that obviously Franco was an arch Catholic nationalist, and clearly, but not a big fan of Judaism. But we do know that he did allow Jews to be saved in Spain despite his alliance with the Nazis. But he did something else in the 40s. his government funded the establishment of the first institute for the study of Sephardic Jewry in Spain, the Instituto Arias Montano, named after a great converso Hebraeus from the 17th century. So as this arch fascist dictator is running the country and imposing kind of a medieval style Catholicism, he's also kind of creating a space where some amazing scholarship was being done on the Jewish past. And it's one of those ironies and kind of the ways that history is not so simple. The right-left divide that we have today or yesterday's often kind of breaks down. It's interesting how these relationships develop in surprising ways. So
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know about that institute. I did know about the Freedom Trail, which is in the book. There's some scenes in the beginning of the book set on the Freedom Trail, and the irony that people are expelled. The Jews were expelled from Spain, the Muslims were expelled from Spain, and here they're coming back during World War II over the Pyrenees on the Freedom Trail, and many of them made it to freedom that way, and it was because Spain stayed neutral during the war. And I tried to balance things in the book with the different characters too, so there's not a sense, there's a sense that the Spanish government is really trying now to make reparations and also to celebrate somewhat the diversity that exists. But of course, you have to have an antagonist as well. And so it was interesting, you try to balance these things, and I'd be curious what you think of that, when you read it.
And yeah, and so if you're talking about that, why don't we talk a little bit about the Carthusians? And because you added them in, and you have a radical Christian sect who want to destroy the archives, and then you have this group of nuns, and I think that's pretty much what we're talking about now.
Yeah, that is part of the balance I was talking about. And I chose the Carthusians for their opposition to dogma, that is part of who they are, the essence of who they are, because they're more mystics than they are traditionalists. And because in September 1944 in Italy, many of them were killed by the SS, by the Nazis, because they sheltered Jews and other refugees. And so, and one of these, some of these people were from Spain that were hiding in this, they call them charter houses, they're monasteries. And so it seemed logical to me that given their history, and they go all the way back to the 11th century, that they might have had a charter house in Almendrales, which is the fictional town that Zahara is beneath. The tunnels of Zahara go from the libraries, through all the libraries, and then to below the monastery, and that there was some support given in that way. Because I thought otherwise, 400 or 500 years, how in the world would they manage to survive without having some help, from outside and recruitment of librarians? And there's enough for several books there in that sense, because I go pretty much from the 15th and 16th century into the present time, when Alienor finally discovers the library underneath her cousin's house. I'm giving something away here, but when she finally discovers the libraries, the stories come together from the past and the present. It's like it locks in then.
And part of that coming together has to do with the second sight. And I was wondering how that kind of, I'm not going to pronounce it, you can pronounce it.
Vijita.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Doreen told me she wants to have vijitas. A few people have told me that because I think it's a desire for knowledge. And in my case, it was also a technical decision as a writer, because I wanted to write the entire book in first person. I felt it would be more personal, and I would avoid certain traps. And for the parts of the book set in the past, then I needed a first person voice. And then I was just writing one day, and I wrote a scene from Alienor's perspective where she merges minds with one of her ancestors. In this case, it was her great aunt Lucia, who's going across the Freedom Trail, and that's one of the very first vijitas that she has. And it was powerful for me. I felt I saw the movie, and I think the screenwriter in me got really involved in trying to pull that off. My writing group thought I was insane. But then it started really working. So sometimes, you try something new. Sometimes it can be a spectacular failure. But in this case, I think it has worked, with the feedback I've gotten from people that it drew them in. And it gave me an opportunity to try to write, firsthand historical scenes. And, you see the people taking the books up the trails in La Pajara, up into the foothills below the mountains, and actually on mules. They were carried in saddlebags, and it's quite an adventure. They actually meet some soldiers on the way and disguise themselves as Dominicans, and it was hard. It was really difficult. And I think there's some historical precedent for this too. I know that some books were rescued. Many books were taken to Granada initially to try to save them from the Inquisition, because it was the last stronghold, from the Reconquista. And so it makes sense to me that some people would have tried to take those books with them when they left into exile, but they haven't really been traced. And that would be something, more for a historian to do. But I did talk with Stefan Roman, who wrote a book, actually it's called Muslim Libraries in the Western World. And I called him and we talked, and I asked him, this is how we met. I said, can you tell me what books you think were burned in 1498? And immediately we just started corresponding like crazy, because he's just so into this. And he just gave me a great deal of encouragement in creating a plot like that. And of course, there were Muslim books, there were Jewish books, there were books from all different cultures, and probably many by Christians as well, who were deemed heretical, because you could be deemed heretical for almost anything in those days. So I think I wandered off course from your question a little bit, but I guess as the vijitas and reality, they come kind of together rather seamlessly. Yeah.
Very much so. And so you kind of alluded to now some of what you used as your research. And I think we all understand why it took 20 years to write this, because there's a lot going on there. How many times did you go to Spain? Did you go to all the different areas that were?
I took 3 trips there, and I stayed in Andalusia, and actually in the area, I made up a fictitious town. One of my friends in Spain, Celia Yanes, I asked her, if you were to make up a town, what would you call it? And she said, well, it should be about almonds. So we called it Almendrales. And and it's actually Ojiva, but a different version of Ojiva that's set more into the wilderness. There are all of these little towns that are up in the mountains there. And so I spent quite a bit of time just sort of being there and trying to absorb it. And then I could see some of the scenes, especially the historical scenes, because not much has changed. I mean, there's roads that where there were once paths, dirt paths, but
Right.
it's very much the same. There's big ravines. And book 2 is also going to be set there as well, because it's just such a fascinating area. And there were so many things I wanted to put in book 1. So I'm kind of, this is, talking about research, The Ornament of the World, this is a very famous book now, because PBS made a movie of it, and all of a sudden people are writing to me, have you read this book? And it's been around a while, and it's how Muslims, Jews, and Christians created a culture of tolerance in medieval Spain, is the title. And so this is the thing that really got me going. I thought, my goodness, there's historical precedents, not just my imagination of what it might be like. And that's another thing when you're doing research for fiction, you make things up and then you sort of start researching and seeing, well, how right was I? Was I close? And then you start, refining it down through the actual research. But it usually starts, in my case, with imagination.
So you kind of alluded to it now. I'm going to skip ahead to a question. You started to talk about book 2. I don't want to give away the end of the book, but I'm trying to understand. Can you tell us a little bit about what book 2 is?
Yeah, Alienor is still at work. And I can tell you that a lot of the vijitas in book 2 are set on the island of Rhodes, some during World War II, which was painful to write. But she has a branch of her family, which is in Seattle, that live there. And so she makes that connection. And then there's a plot in contemporary Spain that has more to do with the disappeared. And because people are still trying to find their relatives, that disappeared during the Civil War, which is also a painful thing. But it's coming together in a positive way because of the way that people help each other and reach out to each other. And like Ronnie was saying, in Spain, the attitude has changed. And so now there's a law of historical memory instead of a pact of forgetting. And I think that's really beautiful, just in itself, that there is this law of historical memory there now. And so that's sort of what book 2 is dedicated to on many levels.
Well, Amy's asking if it has a title yet. I don't know if you're up to that, but
Well, it might be Zahara and the Lost Language, but I'm not sure yet.
And if we want to, I'm going to open it up to questions right after this. But if there's one thing you want your readers to take away from Zahara, what would it be? And in the meantime, while you're answering that, please do accept to open your cameras, and please do open your cameras.
Well, I thought about this question because you had sent it to me, and there's so much, and I decided that what I would hope they would take away, it's in this poem by Rumi. It's a short poem that encapsulates for me the spirit of convivencia. My heart can take on any form: a meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks, sacred ground for idols, Kaaba for the circling pilgrim, the tables of the Torah, the scrolls of the Quran. My creed is love. Wherever its caravan turns along the way, that is my belief, my faith.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rumi.
And Sharon, you had a question? Your hand is up, at least. You can open your microphone now.
Bashwati, you're here.
Joyce,
Okay.
I have a question. While Sharon gets herself unmuted, I have a question for you, if that's okay. Which is, I'm a historian, but I love literature, and I find historical fiction to be a difficult nut to crack, so to speak, and to kind of navigate. What are the dangers do you find in taking historical ideas and putting them into fiction, putting them into fantasy, kind of playing with those, shuttling between that as you do in this novel? What are the pitfalls that you're kind of concerned about, or maybe that's my hang up. I don't know.
No, I think it's a really good question. I think what I set out to do was to be totally accurate as I could be with the history in the book, except for the alternative history that I create. And so in some ways, that is why I wrote the vijitas, because they are visions. They don't claim to be right or to be wrong. A vision is just what it is. And so that enabled me to get beyond the pitfall of feeling I'll never know enough to write this book. Mm-hmm. Because once you start studying history, as I'm sure you well know, it's overwhelming. And there's always another source, there's always another fact. And so working with fantasy and alternative history, I gave myself permission, to bring the spirit alive rather than the facts, although the facts are there. And everything that surrounds the vijitas, and this why I made Alienor a journalist, is because she values the truth and she values accuracy. And so by creating a journalist as my protagonist, I had to be accurate in the sense, that she writes the book, supposedly, but it really was me. But it's in her voice. Yeah. So maybe that helps a little. I tried for a very truthful voice through the journalist. And I don't read a lot of historical fiction, I think, for some of the reasons that you've mentioned. But I think if a writer can bring the spirit alive, or if they're honest, if it's like the Yiddish Policemen's Union, have you read that? It's really alternative history. Right, it's a mystery.
Right. He lays it on the table. Right, exactly.
Yeah, some people love that, and some people really don't like that book. But it had courage. I think it took courage to go into that realm and write it. And it's risky. It's definitely risky. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
And let's see. I lost my train of thought. Please, if there's anybody else that has, sorry, this is what I'm trying to figure out. For some reason I'm a little. So Susanna, you had a question.
Yeah, so More of a comment. Well, yeah, it's a question too. I very look much forward to reading this book and maybe some of the things the other things you've written. Now, I've been told, excuse me, that one should never say this to an author, but I have nothing to lose, so I'm going to pitch it. I'm not a writer. I have an idea that, like if you want to entertain it, I'd be happy to discuss it with you for what might have been 16th century Spain, music and Inquisition.
Music and Inquisition.
Yeah, I mean, I have specifics about a particular composer who was a priest, but he was, and this is true, I mean, he's a real person. He was a priest. He was born into a converso family on his mother's side, and he wrote magnificent music. And I keep thinking that the what if, it's like if he had gotten in touch with his Jewish side. He spent some time in Italy working, so I was thinking like he should have met Salomone Rossi while he was there, but like that didn't happen.
Well, I would say to go for it, and I think there's a lot of books of poetry, and as a matter of fact, the author that Zahara had on recently had this poetry from the Inquisition in Mexico. Yeah, mainly in Mexico, but I think there's more and more research being done. So you'll have really great sources that would be the lyrics to this music. And so I think you could write something that was really realistic, but also, had a lot of imagination. Well, that's not my problem.
She wants you to write the book for her.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I'm pretty well booked, but I'd be happy, to correspond with you and recommend some people for you to talk to as you do your research. I'd be more than happy to do that.
Yeah, it would be interesting, actually. Reach out to them.
Yeah.
We'll talk to you.
I'm sure we would both learn a lot.
I'm on Facebook or Twitter, so I need another means of getting in touch with you.
Yeah, send it to me. I'll send it on.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Edith, you had a question or comment? I don't know. Oh no, you just muted yourself.
There was a question that came in through chat, but
But Edith,
Hold
what
on.
is?
yeah,
I'm
okay.
unmuted.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
Okay.
Dora, it's great to be here, and I'm so thrilled to see this incredible presentation. I
Thank you.
loved Joyce's book. Absolutely, I love it. And I'm looking forward to the next one. As a historical novelist myself, I've looked into similar period and a similar place in the book that you kindly featured, the Lamps of Albarracin, which, like Joyce, I chose to narrate in the first person and in the first person of a Sephardic girl. To return to Ronnie, I did history, social studies, literature, and then law school at Harvard. And one thing that really inspired and motivated me is the fact that, as we all know, history is curated. And what gets recorded is recorded by the powers that be, especially at that point in time, for their own political purposes. So I think if we can reach a point where we have reasonable confidence in our ability to look at primary and good secondary data, I mean, really look at it, and then roll up our sleeves and put our hands into that to try to bring to light episodes which have been suppressed, then as historical novelists, we can make a contribution. Because we can bring it more to the popular readership and to the imagination and raise overall awareness. In the case of my novel, direct resistance to the Inquisitor and to King Ferdinand in what used to be an important port city in Spain, which is no longer known because of the scorched earth punishment that it received at the hands of the Catholic kings. So there's just a lot to be done. And I know that historical fiction is a hard nut for historians for very valid reasons. I just want to encourage Joyce and myself and all of us working on follow-up novels and new novels, that this is an area where I think we can make a very important contribution.
Oh, Edith, do you want to respond, Ronnie, and then I'll say
Oh,
something?
no. You first, please.
What this reminds me of is when I first started writing Zahara, I had coffee with two professors of Spanish history from the University of Washington. And just to tell them about the book and ask their advice about certain things. And when I mentioned that there was going to be some magic realism in the book, I thought I was, I had this preconception in my mind that they would look at me very disapprovingly. And instead they said, no, no, this is the essence of Andalusia. You have to do this. And it freed me. And I realized, don't have these negative expectations from academics. It's just ridiculous. They're just as much a variety as any other population. And that there is, if you can be true to the spirit of something, that people do pick up on it. And so then I just sort of went ahead. But I was glad that I talked with them. I think maybe I did feel that I needed some permission because I'm not an academic. I have a BA, but I've never gotten along that well with academics. I remember having a huge argument with an anthropologist one time, because I said I admired those anthropologists who went into the culture and lived there. And they got really mad at me, because that would destroy objectivity. So, there's so many different ways of looking at it. And it's just wonderful. That's why we write, I think, is just to explore these possibilities for better or for worse.
Yeah, one more thing, Joyce, I'm with you. I had a lot of conversations with Professor David Gitlitz of blessed memory. And in the end, he was very encouraging. And before I dared finalize my draft, I asked him if he would review my entire manuscript for historical accuracy. And that was just the most rewarding and exciting exchange. And so, yes, I believe that, Ronnie, we have as novelists an obligation to do as much as we can to ensure accuracy.
I would just like add to this just a little bit of context, is that historians also, if you study historiography, you understand that historians have ways that we are always situated in our present, in our reality. And so wherever we are in our gender, in our race, in our class, in our own family histories. And so this question of convivencia is one of the most polemical issues in Spanish historiography. Joyce, I was so happy you situated this starting after 9/11. After 9/11, there was a lot of people interested in this. This is a larger, for obvious reasons. At the same time, the reality of convivencia wasn't always pretty. Convivencia just means living together. It doesn't mean getting along. It doesn't mean not hating each other. It doesn't mean not killing each other. It means living next to each other, with each other, learning from each other, absorbing each other's ideas and culture and food, and so that's what's so exciting. I think so. The idea that history is like some monolithic, obviously, is silly. And kind of what you said about the magic realism, it probably puts a historian at ease. It's like, no, this is clearly going to be fiction, right? In other words, it's clearly taking me somewhere. It's clearly working like a time machine, so to speak. And so, perhaps I don't know who you were talking to, but in any case, I think that's, what I hope also is that we can read literature as literature and understand that history, that these things are in dialogue, and we're just trying to make sense of ourselves and our past, right? Our past is useful to understanding ourselves. And and there's so much good stuff on this. It's such a rich area. And since you mentioned Maria Rosa Menocal's wonderful little book, it's super popular. I recommend people to take it with them when they go to Spain. But she also wrote much more serious things, which are much more nuanced and much more layered. There's someone in the chat, Robert Cargney. I'm not saying your name right. I don't know. I'm sorry. Who recommended it, but like she also wrote many, many other things, and her critics wrote great things also. So that dialogue I think is so great and so important. But this time period is of interest to so many people. It's used to talk about Israel and the Palestinians. It's used to talk about America under Trump. It's used to talk about everything because there's something there. So sorry.
No, this is so interesting, and I think it is controversial. And I had the courage to write to Teofilo Ruiz to ask him for a blurb, and he wrote back and he said, "Well, the convivencia was not this, politically there was violence or many other things that happened during that time in Spain." And I told him, I said, "I'm focusing on the cultural collaboration that was part of the convivencia." Because to me, that's the most positive thing, the artists, the musicians, I said, it's not really a political. And they said, "Oh, I'd love to read it." And he wrote a beautiful blurb, but he made it clear to me, he didn't, sort of where the boundary was for him. And that was very interesting. And the other thing is when Abráce, after 9/11, we were invited to sing at an Islamophobia conference that was held in a cathedral. And we're on the stage with a rabbi, an imam, and a bishop. It was really an honor. And we sang songs from Africa and all different places. And the police were back there and, to protect us. It was like not an easy thing after 9/11, but it was amazing. And when I looked out at who was there, who came to this concert, I thought, oh, this is the convivencia in the modern sense. And, like I said, that was 20 odd years ago. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your perspective, Ronnie.
And Roz, if you can open your microphone, I mean, you can, if you will open your
And you
microphone.
too, Edith. Thank you.
Edith, what an amazing sahut, what an amazing honor that Professor Gidlitz, Alava Shalom, was able to read your. That's amazing.
It's a beautiful book.
He's such a generous person, such a
Yeah.
wonderful person.
The Lamps of Albarracín is a very beautiful book.
Joyce, and yes, he was an amazing person. And in fact, it was his groundbreaking work, Secrecy and Deceit, the Religion of the Spanish Crypto Jews, that changed my own life. That's when I realized that the sayings and customs that my mother had raised me with in the United States in the 1970s were from 15th century Spain. It just opened a window on my being, really. And he was so incredibly kind and open, making time. He made time for so many people. I think that's why he was so loved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think it's brought up a lot here is the point that you need to still go to the scholars and still go have, like you were saying, you both were saying, and I know I also go and make sure to research, but then have other people who are scholars on that area. And you must have met with many people, Joyce, because you have so many different eras that you cover. So I'm sure that you had.
Yeah. I think the high school teacher who I interviewed in Spain had the most influence on me in many ways, because he talked about how he was forbidden to teach about the Inquisition or the Civil War in his classes. And so he really wanted me to write this book. And, we're still in touch. I've sent him, it's been translated into Spanish recently. So I was finally able to send him a Spanish copy because he doesn't speak English. And it's also available in Portuguese. So that's meant a lot to me that it's getting out, to Spain and Portugal, and I'm hoping, to go back and do a little tour one of these days. And I think Edith's book has been translated as well.
Yeah.
My book was a bilingual thing.
I want to give a plug for Dr. Joy Rusi's book, her own foray into historical fiction right here that I happen to have. Lea Nassi of Lisbon, a historical novel. So I know she's not going to plug her own work, but I will.
I loved it, and I wrote a blurb. It's on there.
Yes.
Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is. There you go. All right, wonderful. So
us writers have to stick together.
Thank you. I know Roz has a question, but she's not opening her microphone. So on that, I think that we've covered a lot here, and there's a lot to think about. And I do hope that everyone does read the book, because like we've been saying, for those of us who have read it thus far, it's definitely worth a read. And it just gets you thinking about all these things also in the past and also in the present and everywhere in between, because it covers such a breadth of time, place, and philosophy. And it has the right wing and the left wing and in between, and it really covers so much, and it gets you thinking. So I hope you take it to your book clubs, because that's really where it belongs, to have a
Oh,
discussion.
thank you very much, Dora.
Yeah, I'm looking at what you're saying because it seems so foreign to me to know that so much is starting to be talked about in Europe of the Inquisition and actually Ashkenazi persecution as well. To what extent do you think this is having some effect in Europe of both Ashkenazi and Sephardic understanding of this era? Because you really can't explain what's going on today without looking at this past, and there's been such a reluctance to look into this past. To what extent is something really happening in Europe about this?
I think that's a pretty big question. You know, I think in Spain, I can see, you know, there's really been, well, I guess the Jewish Federation in Spain has had a tremendous influence on the government, and they really are trying to value the heritage of the Sephardic Jews, and it also feeds into tourism. There's many synagogues that they're actually reconstructing, and you know they're underground at this point, and they're bringing them up and inviting people to come. And so, you know, that's, to me, that's a real tangible sign that something happening. And it may be for economic reasons, but eventually it will be for other reasons too, when people do start to come and explore this. But I don't know, in other countries, I think there's a rise in anti-Semitism. So I can't really speak about that. You know, I'm not really well informed enough. But I try to look for the positive where I can find it and reinforce it.
And people should look at the comments in the chat, because there are some people responding there as well. Okay, we'll ask for one more question. Baswati?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Joyce, for inviting me and for this nice presentation, very nice presentation. Of course,
Well,
I
thank you
love
for
the
coming.
book, the first volume. As you point out, in fact, more panelists pointed out that anti-Semitism is still very much prominent in Europe and other parts of the world. The other problem we face is disinformation. Will that also feature in your second volume? You know, the amount of disinformation that is being in this age of social media, whereas we are coping with people. First of all, it's possible because of the lack of knowledge about the past.
Yeah, and
Historical
journalists.
knowledge is almost nihil.
Yeah.
And so you can pass off anything as history, which is, I think, is one of the biggest problem we are facing now. And if you have thought about it, and
yeah, I know that you thought about it in your own work as a writer, you know, and I know you have, you know, we've had many talks, and you have a deep sense of history and do a lot of research. And I think for those of us that really value, you know, at least an approach to the truth, maybe there's not absolute truth, but some things are truer than others. And right now, there seems to be no respect for that. And in answer to your question, Alienor, the journalist who's the protagonist of the Zahara series, she's going to come up against this. It's just a normal thing. I just saw a documentary on persecution of journalists that's on HBO. I can't remember the name of it, but it's easy to find. And it covers them in several countries, including the United States, how difficult it is to just cover things even and not be attacked.
Yes,
not
in
be
India,
attacked.
journalists, for example, are being, you know, incarcerated every day, even for revealing, the fact-checking sites. Journalists working for fact-checking sites are, being facing trials.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, Russia's an extreme example, but it seems to be happening, all over the place.
Yeah.
And that's, there is a current, and I think Ronnie was talking about that, this whole positive current that does go through. And so trying to connect with it and strengthen it is maybe all that we can do during certain periods of history. I've often wondered about that, how people survived, during World War II and came out with some sense of humanity and belief. It's kind of overwhelming, but I think that's the human capacity for visualizing something better.
That's a wonderful way to end. So thank you. I do encourage everybody to please go to the chat because there have been people posting all kinds of collections, including Professor Corellis, thank you, to help research more of this time period or some of the time periods covered. And I think this was a strong way to end our season. I encourage everybody to check back with us in September. So this was the end of this school year, if you want to call it that. And so thank you very much, Joyce, for ending us on a strong note. Thank you all for joining us, and please do stay in touch. We love hearing from you and we love all the comments. So thank you.
Can you save the